Hi everyone, and welcome back to Stellar HFY. First, thank you. The support you've shown lately has been incredible. Every like, share, and tactical analysis you've posted in the comments shows me you're hungry for the kind of warfare that breaks all the rules. Today, we're stepping into a solar system where 200 alien warships thought they had written humanity's final chapter, where admirals laughed at cargo ships and mining vessels, where surrender seemed like the only option. And then humanity said, hold our beer. Let's find out what happens when desperation meets innovation. Sir, we have incoming priority transmission from Deep Space Monitoring Station Alpha 7. The communications officer's voice cracked slightly, and Commander Marcus Thorne knew immediately that whatever was coming through those speakers would change everything. Put it through, Lieutenant. The holographic display flickered to life, showing the haggard face of Station Commander Elena Vasquez. Behind her, warning lights bathed the command center in hellish red. Marcus, they're here. 200 ships, maybe more. Hegemony Third Armada just dropped out of hyperspace at the system's edge. Jesus Christ, Marcus. It's the entire fleet. Thorne felt his stomach drop into his boots. Confirm that number, Elena. 200? Confirmed. Long-range sensors are picking up their command signatures now. We're looking at battle cruisers, destroyers, carrier groups, the works. They're broadcasting on all frequencies, demanding complete surrender within 72 hours. Vasquez's voice was steady, but Thorne could see the terror in her eyes. Marcus, where's our fleet? Where's Admiral Chen's task force? That was the question Thorne had been dreading. 3 months out at Centauri, they're engaged with what we thought was the main hegemony force. He rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of 18 months of carefully orchestrated deception crashing down on them. Elena, it was all a setup. They've been feeding us false intelligence for over a year, making us think their primary target was the colonies. They wanted our main fleet as far from Earth as possible. The transmission cut out, leaving Thorne staring at his own reflection in the dead holographic projector. Around him, the command center of Orbital Defense Station Meridian buzzed with frantic activity as officers tried to make sense of readings that showed the impossible. Thorne had been assigned to this posting 6 months ago, what High Command euphemistically called non-essential operations coordination. In plainer terms, he was the guy they put in charge of the leftovers, the aging patrol ships too old for frontline duty, the orbital platforms that should have been decommissioned years ago, and the handful of experimental vessels that barely qualified as functional. He pulled up the tactical display, and the numbers hit him like a physical blow. Earth's entire defensive capability consisted of 37 patrol craft, most of them running on reactor cores that should have been replaced a decade ago, 12 orbital weapons platforms with enough firepower to maybe scratch the paint on a hegemony destroyer, and 1 prototype stealth frigate that worked exactly half the time, against 200 of the galaxy's most advanced warships. Commander, incoming transmission from Earth Defense Command, announced his communications officer, Lieutenant Torres. It's General Morrison, sir. The general's face appeared on screen, and Thorne could see the man had aged 10 years in the past hour. Marcus, I'm going to be direct with you. The President is preparing evacuation protocols. We're looking at complete orbital withdrawal within 48 hours. I need you to coordinate with civilian traffic control and get our people out of the system. Sir, with respect, what about fighting? We still have ships. We still have... Morrison cut him off. Marcus, look at your screen. Look at those numbers. This isn't a battle, it's an execution. The hegemony didn't send 200 ships to negotiate. They sent them to make an example. The general's shoulders sagged. I'm sorry, son. There's nothing left to fight with. The transmission ended, and Thorne found himself staring at the tactical display again. 37 patrol ships against 200 battle cruisers. It wasn't just hopeless, it was mathematically impossible. Every simulation his tactical computer ran came back with the same result. Total annihilation within the first 6 minutes of engagement. Commander, we're receiving the hegemony broadcast, Torres called out. They're transmitting on all civilian frequencies. Put it on main display. The screen filled with the image of Admiral Vex Korath, the hegemony's most decorated military commander. His reptilian features were twisted into what passed for a smile among his species, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth. People of Earth, I am Admiral Korath of the Third Armada. Your military leaders have 72 hours to transmit formal surrender terms. Any attempt at resistance will result in the complete sterilization of your world. Your fleet is gone. Your defenses are pathetic. Accept the inevitable. The transmission cut to tactical scans of Earth's orbital defenses, and Thorne watched in sick fascination as Korath's analysts dissected every weakness, every vulnerability. They knew exactly what humanity had left to fight with, and they were broadcasting it for everyone to see. The message was clear. Resistance was not just futile, it was laughable. Sir, Torres said quietly, Captain Reeves from the Phantom is requesting secure communication. He says it's about alternative options. Thorne looked around his command center at the faces of his officers, men and women who had signed up to defend Earth and were now watching their world prepare to surrender without firing a shot. The Phantom was their experimental stealth frigate, a Turnum ship that technically worked but had been deemed operationally unsuitable by every admiral who'd reviewed its performance reports. Captain David Reeves was one of the few pilots crazy enough to keep flying the temperamental vessel. Alternative options. Thorne almost laughed at the phrase. What alternatives could there possibly be when facing 200 enemy warships with nothing but spare parts and good intentions? Put him through, Lieutenant. Secure channel. Captain David Reeves appeared on the secure holographic display, his weathered face showing the kind of calm that only came from flying experimental ships through impossible situations. Behind him, the cramped bridge of the Phantom hummed with the sound of systems that required constant manual adjustment to keep functioning. Marcus, I've been monitoring civilian traffic patterns for the past 6 months as part of our testing protocol. Reeves began without preamble. I've got something you need to hear. There are over 300 civilian vessels currently in system, trapped by the hegemony blockade. We're talking everything from massive asteroid mining ships to freight haulers to passenger liners. Thorne leaned forward. David, we're facing 200 enemy warships. I'm not sure how 300 sitting ducks are going to help our situation. That's where you're wrong. Reeves pulled up a data display showing ship registrations and cargo manifests. Most of these vessels belong to the Outer Belt Mining Consortium. These aren't your typical merchant marines, Marcus. These are the crews who've been fighting hegemony raiders for the past 5 years. They know what surrender means for human colonies because they've seen what happens to the ones that tried it. The display shifted to show mining vessels, their hulls scarred from asteroid impacts and pirate attacks. Thorne had heard stories about the belt miners, tough, independent crews who lived and worked in the most dangerous regions of the solar system. They weren't military, but they weren't exactly civilians either. I've been talking to their foreman, Jake Sullivan, Reeves continued. He's coordinating evacuation efforts, but his people are asking questions. They want to know if there's any way to fight back. Fight back with what? Mining ships don't have weapon systems. Reeves smiled grimly. No, but they have something better. Do you know what these ships are carrying right now, Marcus? Industrial explosives, mining charges, refined fuel components. We're looking at more raw destructive power than Earth's entire military arsenal, just sitting in cargo holds. Thorne felt something shift in his chest. Not hope exactly, but the absence of complete despair. You're talking about turning civilian ships into weapons. I'm talking about Protocol 7, Reeves said, the emergency requisition authority that allows military commanders to conscript civilian vessels during existential threats. It's been on the books for 50 years, but nobody's ever used it because nobody's ever been this desperate. The idea was insane, but as Thorne looked at his tactical display showing those impossible odds, insane was starting to look like their only option. Even if we could convert civilian ships into makeshift weapons, how would we coordinate them? These aren't trained military pilots, David. They're freight captains and mining foremen. That's where the Phantom comes in. Reeves leaned closer to the camera. This ship's experimental sensor suite isn't just for stealth. It can achieve real-time coordination of multiple vessels through quantum encrypted data bursts. To enemy sensors, it looks like background static, but we could use it to coordinate hundreds of independent ships in real time. Thorne's mind was racing now. You're talking about using civilian ships as guided missiles. I'm talking about using what we have instead of surrendering without a fight. Marcus, these people have been asking me all morning if there's anything they can do. Freight Captain Maria Santos told me she'd rather die fighting than watch her grandchildren grow up as hegemony slaves. Mining foreman Jake Sullivan says his crews have been preparing for this day since the first colony fell. The secure channel crackled, and suddenly another voice joined the conversation. Commander Thorne, this is Jake Sullivan, Outer Belt Mining Consortium. Captain Reeves patched me in. The voice was gravelly, weathered by years of shouting orders over mining equipment. Sir, I've got 214 ships under my coordination, and every single crew has voted. We're not running. Thorne stared at the communication display. Sullivan, you understand what we're talking about here? This isn't some heroic last stand. This is a suicide mission. Commander, my brother was on the colony ship that tried to surrender to the hegemony at Kepler 442. You know what they found when our fleet finally got there? Mass graves. The hegemony doesn't take prisoners, sir. They take examples. Sullivan's voice carried the weight of personal loss. My crews know the score. We've been hauling mining charges and industrial explosives for decades. We know exactly how much damage these ships can do if we pack the cargo holds right. Reeves nodded. Marcus, Sullivan's people have the expertise to turn every civilian ship into a massive bomb. We have the coordination technology to guide them to their targets. And thanks to 18 months of hegemony intelligence operations, we know exactly where their fleet will be positioned when they expect us to surrender. The pieces were clicking together in Thorne's mind, forming the outline of something that was either brilliant or completely insane. You're talking about disguising an attack as civilian evacuation panic. I'm talking about using the enemy's expectations against them, Reeves replied. They're expecting us to run. They're expecting chaos and fear. What they're not expecting is 300 civilian ships loaded with explosives, coordinated by stealth technology they don't know we have, all pretending to flee in panic while actually maneuvering into attack positions. Sullivan's voice crackled through the comm. Commander, we've got mining ships that can carry 50 tons of concentrated explosives, freight haulers that can pack their holds with enough fuel components to crack asteroids. Even the passenger liners are volunteering. They can ram with enough force to take out a destroyer's bridge. Thorne looked around his command center again, seeing his officers listening to every word. The hopelessness was still there, but it was mixing with something else now. The possibility that maybe, just maybe, they didn't have to go down without swinging back. Gentlemen, Thorne said slowly, you're talking about the largest coordinated kamikaze attack in human history. Yes, sir, Sullivan replied without hesitation, and every single one of my people is ready to make that flight. Jake, what you're showing me here violates every safety protocol ever written, Captain Reeves said, staring at the explosive configuration Sullivan had sketched out on his tablet. They were hunched over a workstation in the Phantom's cramped engineering bay, surrounded by the constant hum of experimental systems that required manual calibration every few hours. Sullivan wiped grease from his hands with a rag that had seen better decades. Captain, I've been blowing up asteroids for 30 years. Trust me when I say I know exactly how much bang we can pack into these cargo holds without the ships falling apart before they reach their targets. He pointed to the schematic showing a massive freight hauler's interior. See, we remove all the safety containment systems, pack the mining charges directly against the hull supports, and use fuel line conduits to create shaped charges. When these babies hit, they'll punch through battlecruiser armor like it's tissue paper. Reeves ran his fingers through his graying hair. And you're absolutely certain 200 civilian crews can execute coordinated attack runs without any military training? That's where you're wrong, Captain. Sullivan's voice carried the weight of hard-earned experience. These aren't office workers we're talking about. Asteroid mining requires precision flying through debris fields that would shred a military pilot. Freight captains navigate shipping lanes where one wrong move means collision with 1,000-ton cargo containers. These people have been doing death-defying flying their entire careers. They just called it Tuesday. The past 18 hours had been a blur of frantic preparation. Thorne had activated Protocol 7, and word had spread through the civilian fleet like wildfire. Some captains had refused outright, taking their ships and fleeing toward the outer system, in the hope of escaping before the hegemony tightened their blockade. But for every ship that ran, two more volunteered. Mining crews, freight captains, even passenger liner pilots were stepping forward, asking how they could help turn their vessels into weapons. "Commander, we've got a problem," Lieutenant Torres announced over the comm system. "Civilian vessel Prosperity's Dream is reporting that Captain Williams is having second thoughts. His crew is threatening mutiny if he goes through with the mission." Thorne closed his eyes and counted to 5. This was the part he'd been dreading. "Put me through to Captain Williams." The face that appeared on screen was pale and sweating. Captain Robert Williams looked like he hadn't slept in days, which was probably accurate. Behind him, Thorne could hear shouting from his crew quarters. "Commander, I'm sorry, but I can't do this. I signed up to haul cargo, not to commit suicide. My engineer is threatening to sabotage the engines if I don't turn back." "Captain Williams, I understand your position, but—" "No, you don't understand," Williams' voice cracked. "I've got a wife and 2 kids back on Earth. How do I look them in the eye and tell them I'm flying a bomb into an enemy ship? How do I explain that I chose to die instead of trying to get them to safety?" The channel went quiet except for the sound of Williams breathing heavily. Thorne could see the man's hands shaking as he gripped the edge of his captain's chair. This was what kept Thorne awake at night, the knowledge that he was asking ordinary people to make extraordinary sacrifices, that every name on his volunteer list represented a family that would never see their loved ones again. "Captain," Thorne said quietly, "nobody's forcing you to do this. Take your ship and get your family out of the system. We'll find another volunteer." Before Williams could respond, another voice cut into the channel. "This is Captain Maria Santos of the freight hauler Iron Will. Captain Williams, my grandson is 8 years old. You know what I told him when I said goodbye? I told him that sometimes grown-ups have to do scary things so kids can grow up free." Her voice was steady, matter of fact. "I'm not doing this because I want to die. I'm doing this because the alternative is watching that boy grow up as a slave." Williams stared at his screen, tears running down his cheeks. "Captain Santos, I don't know if I'm brave enough." "Nobody asked you to be brave," Santos replied. "Just asked you to be there when it counts. But if you can't, that's okay too. Someone else will take your place." The channel closed, and within minutes, Torres reported that 3 more ships had volunteered to replace any vessels that withdrew. The mathematics of desperation, Thorne realized. For every person who couldn't face the prospect of certain death, there were others who had already accepted it as the price of defiance. Meanwhile, Thorne had begun the most elaborate deception of his military career. He'd opened formal surrender negotiations with Admiral Korath, broadcasting on all channels to establish the fiction that Earth's government was preparing to capitulate. The conversations were carefully scripted to buy time while projecting the image of a broken, defeated leadership. "Admiral Korath, this is Commander Marcus Thorne, representing Earth Defense Command," he transmitted during one of their scheduled communications. "Our government is prepared to discuss terms for orderly surrender, but we need assurances about the treatment of civilian populations." Korath's reptilian features twisted into what might have been amusement. "Commander Thorne, you are hardly in a position to negotiate terms. However, I am prepared to be generous. Civilian populations will be relocated to designated areas where they can contribute to hegemony productivity. Your military personnel will be processed according to standard protocols." The words sent ice through Thorne's veins. He'd read the intelligence reports about standard protocols and productivity relocation, mass executions and slave labor camps. But he forced his voice to remain calm and defeated. "We'll need time to coordinate the civilian evacuation and prepare our military facilities for handover. You have 48 hours, Commander. I suggest you use them wisely." As the transmission ended, Thorne allowed himself a moment of grim satisfaction. Korath was behaving exactly as predicted, maintaining his fleet in standard blockade formation, keeping his ships positioned for maximum psychological impact rather than tactical flexibility. The hegemony doctrine called for overwhelming displays of force during surrender negotiations, and Korath was following it to the letter. "Commander, we're getting real-time sensor data from civilian ships throughout the system," Reeves reported from the Phantom's bridge. "Every freight scanner, mining sensor, and navigation array is feeding us information about hegemony fleet positions. They have no idea we're mapping their entire formation." The civilian ships were scattering in seemingly random patterns, appearing to flee in panic while actually establishing overlapping approach vectors that would allow them to attack from multiple directions simultaneously. To external observers, it looked like complete chaos, exactly what the hegemony expected from a terrified civilian population. In reality, every movement was coordinated through the Phantom's encrypted communication system, invisible to enemy sensors as background static. Sir, incoming priority transmission from Admiral Korath, Torres announced. He's broadcasting to all ships in the system. Korath's image filled the main display, his confidence radiating through the screen. People of Earth, your pathetic military leadership continues to delay the inevitable. To demonstrate the futility of resistance, I am ordering my fleet into ceremonial formation. You will witness the full might of the Hegemony Third Armada as we prepare to accept your surrender. The transmission showed external cameras capturing the enemy fleet as it began moving into parade formation, exactly what Thorne had been hoping for. Sullivan's gravelly voice crackled over the comm. Commander, every ship is loaded and ready. My people are saying their prayers and checking their systems one last time. When you give the word, we'll show these bastards what human freight haulers can do. All right, people, listen up. Thorne's voice carried across the communication network to over 200 civilian ships scattered throughout the solar system. In 30 minutes, every ship in this system is going to drop the pretense and show the hegemony what happens when you corner desperate humans. I want you to know that what you're about to do will be remembered for as long as humanity exists among the stars. The responses came flooding back through the Phantom's encrypted channels. Captain Santos, ready to deliver the mail, Commander. Jake Sullivan, mining crews locked and loaded. Captain Torres from the passenger liner Stellar Dream. We've got 400 passengers who voted to stay aboard. They said if we're going down swinging. Thorne felt the weight of every life in his hands, like a physical pressure on his chest. These weren't soldiers trained for suicide missions. They were ordinary people who had chosen to transform themselves into human missiles because surrender meant something worse than death. In the past hour, he'd received over 50 personal messages from civilian volunteers. Final letters to loved ones, instructions for how to care for pets left behind. A mining foreman named Rodriguez had recorded a lullaby for his 3-year-old daughter, telling her that Daddy was going on a trip to keep the monsters away. Commander, we're receiving final system checks from all volunteer vessels, Lieutenant Torres reported. Engineering reports confirm explosive charges are armed and ready. Navigation systems show optimal approach vectors locked in. Sir, they're ready when you are. Through the Phantom's sensor array, Thorne watched Admiral Korath's fleet completing its ceremonial formation around Earth. 200 massive warships arranged in perfect geometric patterns, designed to showcase hegemony military might. It was beautiful in its way, a demonstration of technological superiority that should have been overwhelming. Instead, it was exactly what Thorne needed. Predictable positions, fixed formations, and enemy attention focused on Earth rather than on the scattered civilian vessels that were about to become guided missiles. Jake, are your people ready? Thorne asked over the private channel to Sullivan's command ship. Commander, I won't lie to you. Some of my crews are scared out of their minds. But scared and ready aren't mutually exclusive. We've spent our whole lives in the belt, knowing that one mistake means floating in vacuum. Today's just another day where the margin for error is zero. Sullivan's voice carried decades of authority earned in the most dangerous profession in human space. My ships are loaded with enough concentrated explosives to crack moons. When we hit those hegemony bastards, there won't be enough left to identify with DNA analysis. Captain Reeves' voice crackled through from the Phantom's bridge. Marcus, enemy fleet has completed ceremonial positioning. All ships are maintaining parade formation, minimal maneuvering capability. If we're going to do this, now's the time. Thorne closed his eyes and saw the faces of every civilian volunteer who had stepped forward. Maria Santos, who'd kissed a photo of her grandson before loading her freight hauler with mining charges. Captain Williams, who had ultimately decided to stay after his engineer, convinced him that running wouldn't save their families. Jake Sullivan, whose brother had died in a hegemony processing facility and who had been waiting 5 years for a chance at revenge. All ships, this is Commander Thorne. Execute attack pattern Delta. Show them what humans do when you threaten our home. The transformation was instantaneous. Throughout the solar system, over 200 civilian vessels simultaneously dropped their evacuation pretense and accelerated directly toward predetermined targets. Mining ships that had been fleeing in panic suddenly revealed engine modifications that pushed them to speeds that should have torn their hulls apart. Freight haulers jettisoned empty containers to reduce mass and increase acceleration. Even passenger liners, their holds packed with fuel-soaked debris, began attack runs that would have impressed military pilots. Enemy fleet is reacting, Reeves reported. They're attempting evasive maneuvers, but their ceremonial formation is working against them. Ships are colliding with each other, trying to break away. Admiral Korath's voice exploded across all communication channels. All ships, emergency scatter. These are not fleeing civilians. Repeat, we are under coordinated attack. Point defense systems online. Prepare for ramming attempts. But it was too late. The hegemony fleet, arranged for maximum visual impact rather than tactical flexibility, found themselves unable to respond effectively to attacks coming from dozens of different vectors simultaneously. Their point defense systems, designed to intercept missiles and fighter craft, were overwhelmed by the sheer number of incoming targets, many of them massive industrial ships that absorbed defensive fire without slowing down. The first impact came from Captain Santos's freight hauler Iron Will, striking a hegemony destroyer amidships with enough force to break the enemy vessel in half. The mining charges in her cargo hold detonated a split second later, creating an explosion that lit up space like a newborn star. The blast was so intense that nearby hegemony ships suffered hull breaches from the shock wave alone. Direct hit on enemy battle. Group Alpha, Torres reported, his voice filled with awe. Multiple secondary explosions. Jesus Christ, sir, they're taking out entire formations with single impacts. Jake Sullivan's voice cut through the communication network. This is for my brother, you alien bastards. His mining ship, Prospector's Dream, loaded with 50 tons of concentrated industrial explosives, impacted Admiral Korath's flagship dead center. The explosion that followed was visible from Earth's surface, a brief second sun that outshone everything else in the sky before fading to leave nothing but expanding debris. All around the solar system, similar impacts were occurring with mathematical precision. Mining ships packed with shaped charges punched through battlecruiser armor like armor-piercing rounds. Passenger liners, their holds filled with fuel-soaked debris, created massive fireballs that consumed entire enemy squadrons. Even small personal craft, loaded with every explosive device their owners could acquire, darted between larger ships to strike critical systems on enemy vessels. Enemy fleet cohesion is completely broken, Reeves reported. Surviving ships are attempting to retreat, but they're scattered and damaged. Sir, we're looking at over 60% enemy casualties, and the battle's only been running for 17 minutes. Thorne stared at his tactical display, watching red icons representing hegemony ships wink out one by one as civilian volunteers completed their final missions. Each disappearing icon represented not just an enemy vessel destroyed, but human lives spent to achieve that destruction. Victory and loss intertwined so completely that celebrating felt wrong, but so did mourning. Commander, we're receiving surrender requests from surviving hegemony vessels, Torres announced. They're asking for terms. Through the bridge speakers, they could hear the panicked voice of a hegemony ship captain. This is Captain Zex of the cruiser Dominion. Our fleet is destroyed. Our admiral is dead. We request immediate ceasefire and formal surrender terms. Please respond. We are no longer a threat to your system. Thorne looked around his command center at officers who had expected to die today, and instead found themselves accepting enemy surrender. Outside, the debris field that had once been the Third Armada continued to expand, a monument to what happened when ordinary people decided that some things were worth dying for. Commander, we're intercepting hegemony emergency transmissions across 17 different frequencies, Lieutenant Torres announced, his voice barely containing the disbelief that had been building for the past 3 hours. Sir, they're calling this the Meridian Massacre. Their surviving ship captains are reporting complete fleet annihilation by what they're describing as weaponized civilian population. Thorne stood before the main tactical display, staring at the debris field that stretched across thousands of kilometers of space. What had been Admiral Korath's Third Armada was now nothing more than twisted metal and expanding gas clouds. The numbers were still coming in, but initial reports showed that 214 civilian ships had successfully completed their attack runs, destroying or crippling 123 enemy vessels. The remaining hegemony ships had either surrendered immediately or fled toward the outer system in complete disarray. "Patch me through to Captain Zex of the Dominion," Thorne ordered. The hegemony officer who appeared on screen looked like he had aged a decade in the past hour. His reptilian features were pale, and his hands shook as he gripped his command chair. "Commander Thorne, I formally surrender my vessel and request safe passage for medical evacuation of my wounded," Captain Zex said, his voice barely above a whisper. "In 30 years of military service, I have never witnessed anything like what your people just did. We thought we understood human warfare, but this was something else entirely." Thorne studied the alien officer's face and saw something he hadn't expected. Not just fear, but genuine respect mixed with horror. "Captain Zex, your medical requests are granted, but I need you to understand something. What you witnessed today wasn't human warfare. It was human desperation. There's a difference." The transmission ended, but the implications of that conversation would ripple outward for months to come. Within hours, fragmentary reports of Earth's defense had reached hegemony outposts throughout the sector. The story spread through their communication networks like wildfire. An entire armada destroyed not by superior technology or military genius, but by ordinary civilians who had transformed cargo ships into guided missiles and chosen death over surrender. "Sir, we're receiving intelligence intercepts from our deep space monitoring stations," Torres reported. "Hegemony fleet commanders throughout the galaxy are requesting immediate reinforcement packages. They're claiming that any operations in human space now require triple the standard force allocation due to civilian weaponization protocols." The strategic implications were staggering. For decades, military planners had calculated force requirements based on the assumption that civilian populations were irrelevant to space combat. Ships, weapons, trained personnel, these were the variables that determined victory or defeat. But Earth had just demonstrated that the largest variable in any conflict might be the willingness of ordinary people to sacrifice everything for their freedom. Captain Reeves materialized on the holographic display from the Phantom's bridge, his face grim. "Marcus, you need to see this. We're intercepting communications from human colonies throughout the sector. Word of what happened here is spreading, and it's having effects we didn't anticipate." The transmission shifted to show recorded messages from colony, worlds that had been under hegemony occupation for years. On New Vladivostok, mining crews were organizing strikes and sabotage operations. On Kepler Station, freight captains were forming what they called civilian defense militias. Most shocking of all, on the agricultural world of New Terra, families were volunteering to pack their personal shuttles with fertilizer bombs and fly them at hegemony garrison ships. "Jesus Christ," Thorne muttered. "What have we started?" The answer came from an unexpected source. General Morrison's face appeared on the secure command channel, but he looked different, younger somehow, despite the exhaustion lines around his eyes. "Marcus, I'm going to be direct with you. 3 hours ago, I was preparing Earth's surrender documents. Now I'm fielding calls from colony governors asking for technical specifications on civilian ship weaponization. The President wants to know if we can standardize this protocol for system-wide defense implementation." Thorne felt a chill run down his spine. "Sir, with respect, what we did today wasn't a replicable military strategy. It was a desperate gamble that cost over 20,000 civilian lives. These people aren't coming home, General. Their families are never going to see them again." "I understand the cost, Commander," Morrison replied quietly, "but the hegemony is already responding. Our intelligence sources report that their High Council has called an emergency session. Multiple fleet commanders are refusing deployment orders to human sectors without massive reinforcement packages. Some are requesting reassignment entirely rather than face what they're calling suicide civilian tactics." The implications were becoming clear. The hegemony had built their empire on the assumption that civilian populations could be safely ignored during military operations, that the distinction between combatants and non-combatants was a fixed boundary that determined the scope of any conflict. Earth had just shattered that assumption completely. Commander, priority transmission coming in from Hegemony High Command, Torres announced. They're requesting immediate ceasefire negotiations. Morrison's expression shifted from exhaustion to something approaching hope. Marcus, patch me through to that transmission. I want to hear this myself. The alien who appeared on screen wore the elaborate robes of a Hegemony Council member, but his usual air of absolute authority was notably absent. I am Counselor Vash of the High Council. We are prepared to discuss immediate cessation of hostilities and formal recognition of human territorial sovereignty. However, we require guarantees regarding the weaponization of civilian populations during peacetime operations. Thorne looked at General Morrison, who nodded slowly. The message was clear. The hegemony wasn't just requesting peace. They were afraid. For the first time in their imperial expansion, they had encountered an enemy that couldn't be defeated through conventional military superiority because that enemy refused to accept the conventional rules of engagement. Counselor Vash, Morrison responded, we're prepared to discuss terms, but I think you need to understand something about humans that your intelligence analysts missed. When you threaten our families, our homes, our freedom to exist, there is no distinction between civilian and military. There are only the people who will fight and die to protect what matters to them, and the people who won't. The transmission ended, leaving the command center in stunned silence. Outside, the debris field continued to expand, carrying with it the scattered atoms of two civilizations' assumptions about warfare, sacrifice, and the price of freedom. The Hegemony High Council has transmitted their formal ceasefire proposal, General Morrison announced to the assembled officers in Earth Defense Command's briefing room. 3 weeks had passed since the battle, but the conference table was still surrounded by the same people who had witnessed the impossible. The complete defeat of a superior enemy force by ordinary civilians turned into weapons of war. Thorne read through the document, noting the careful language that revealed more than the hegemony probably intended. They're offering full territorial sovereignty for all human colonies, cessation of expansion into human space, and formal recognition of human government authority. In exchange, they want guarantees that civilian populations won't be weaponized during peacetime operations. He looked up at Morrison. Sir, they're not negotiating. They're surrendering. Morrison nodded grimly. Our intelligence sources confirm it. The hegemony is facing what their military analysts are calling a logistical cascade failure. Every fleet commander in their empire is demanding triple reinforcements for any operations near human space. Some sectors are requesting complete reassignment rather than face what they're calling civilian weaponization protocols. The resources they'd need to maintain their empire while fighting humanity simply don't exist. Captain Reeves, recently promoted to admiral and given command of the new Stealth Reconnaissance Division, leaned forward. Marcus, it's bigger than just resource allocation. We're receiving intelligence reports from across the galaxy. The hegemony's subject species are asking questions they never asked before. If humans can turn freight haulers into weapons that destroy battle cruisers, what's stopping other species from doing the same thing? The strategic revolution was complete, but the human cost remained devastating. Thorne had spent the past 3 weeks attending memorial services for civilian volunteers who had died in the attack. Maria Santos, who had kissed her grandson's photo before loading her freight hauler with mining charges. Jake Sullivan, whose mining ship had taken out Admiral Korath's flagship in an explosion visible from Earth's Sarn. Surface Captain Williams, who had overcome his fear at the last moment and delivered his passenger liner into the heart of an enemy formation. The President has asked me to inform you that you're being promoted to Admiral, Marcus, Morrison said quietly. You'll be taking command of Earth's rebuilt defense fleet and implementing what they're calling the Civilian Integration Protocol. The idea is to formally incorporate civilian assets into our military planning while maintaining the ethical boundaries that separate us from our enemies. Thorne felt the weight of command settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. Sir, I need you to understand something. What we did wasn't a victory in any traditional sense. We sent 20,000 people to their deaths because we didn't have any other choice. If we're going to make this part of our doctrine, we need to be absolutely certain that we never put ordinary people in that position again unless the alternative is extinction. The room fell silent as everyone absorbed the implications. They had won, but victory felt hollow when measured against the cost. These hadn't been soldiers trained for sacrifice. They had been mothers and fathers, grandparents and young adults just starting their lives, people who had volunteered for suicide missions because the alternative was watching their families live as slaves. Admiral Thorne, Morrison said, using the new rank deliberately, the truth is that what happened here changed everything, not just for us, but for every species in the galaxy. The hegemony built their empire on the assumption that civilian populations could be safely ignored during military operations. You proved that assumption wrong in the most dramatic way possible. Through the briefing room's windows, Thorne could see the construction crews working on new orbital platforms. But these weren't traditional military installations. They were hybrid facilities designed to coordinate both military and civilian vessels in real time, incorporating the lessons learned from the battle. The Phantom's experimental technology was being reverse engineered and installed throughout the system, creating a network that could turn any civilian ship into a guided weapon if necessary. The memorial services are scheduled for this afternoon, Morrison continued. Every civilian volunteer will be honored with full military recognition. Their families will receive benefits equivalent to fallen military personnel, and their names will be inscribed on a monument that will remind future generations what the price of freedom sometimes requires. Thorne stood and looked out at the orbital construction, thinking about the conversations he'd had with civilian volunteers in those final hours before the battle. They hadn't been seeking glory or military honors. They had been ordinary people making an extraordinary choice because someone had to. The lesson wasn't that civilians should be weaponized, but that when survival itself was at stake, the distinction between civilian and military became meaningless. Sir, there's one more thing the hegemony needs to understand, Thorne said finally. What they witnessed wasn't a military strategy or a replicable tactical doctrine. It was proof that humans will do whatever it takes to protect their families, their homes, and their right to exist free from oppression. We didn't turn our civilians into weapons. We simply showed them what happens when you threaten everything humans hold dear. Morrison smiled grimly. That message has already been received, Admiral. Hegemony intelligence reports indicate they're classifying humanity as what they call a non-conquerable species. Too dangerous to subjugate because the entire population becomes combatants when threatened with extinction. The formal ceasefire was signed 6 hours later, establishing a new paradigm for human space defense that integrated civilian assets with military command while maintaining clear ethical boundaries. But the real victory wasn't in the treaty terms or the strategic implications. It was in the knowledge that when ordinary people were asked to make extraordinary sacrifices for freedom, they had answered without hesitation. As Thorne walked through the memorial garden where 20,000 names were being carved into black stone, he understood that the fleet that wasn't supposed to exist had accomplished something no conventional military force could have achieved. They had made humanity too dangerous to conquer, not through superior technology or tactical brilliance, but through the simple demonstration that some things were worth dying for and that humans would always choose death over slavery. The stars looked different now, not as distant points of light, but as destinations that would always be protected by people willing to transform anything, even themselves, into weapons when freedom itself was at stake.